Hello and welcome to this examination of the reality and feasibility of Tiberium. This is a xenosubstance with an unknown provenance that holds a substantial place in the Command & Conquer universe. It is described as a crystalline substance that was first discovered in 1995. It is highly valued and considered dangerous to carbon-based lifeforms. It's described as this by the in-game expert Dr. Ignatius Mobius.
Dr. Mobius, tell our viewers just what Tiberium really is.
Molecularly, it's a non-carbon-based element that appears to have strong ferrous qualities with non-resonating reversible energy that has a tendency to disrupt carbon-based molecular structures with inconsequent and unequal positrons orbiting on the first, second, and ninth quark rings.
Whoa, is that good or bad?
Ooh, let me put it this way, Eddie. The possibilities of Tiberium are limitless.
Mobius himself believes that rather than a mineral or similar, Tiberium is a life form. This is at least somewhat supported and mitigated by its chemical composition. It's more than 42% phosphor, 32 and a bit % iron, 15% calcium, nearly 6% copper, 2.5% silica, and 1.5% of an unknown composition. Further to this, it is said that Tiberium leaches metals and other heavy minerals out of the soil. These are concentrated in crystals, and these are then harvested. Between 1995 and 2034, it spread out and covered a lot of the planet. In the process of doing so, it both transformed and adapted the flora and fauna. In doing so, it had to release spores and gases. These various mutated plants and animals then built onto this process of spreading spores and gases. Areas contaminated by it are considered uninhabitable for humans. This got so bad that at one point you could detect levels of Tiberium in the air. Within the game itself, there have been efforts to reclaim territory overtaken by Tiberium, but this has always led to difficulties. Primarily that somehow Tiberium would respond and evolve in response to those reclamation efforts, and Tiberium, despite all efforts, retained hostile qualities. Tiberium undergoes a series of evolutionary or adaptative steps throughout the game, or at least the entire game series. Tiberium can spread almost anywhere, the rate of this spread being influenced by soil density and the temperature. Tiberium itself prefers those areas that are warmer. The colder the region, the more resistant it is to infiltration by Tiberium. Tiberium spreads through an unexplained and not well understood mutagenic process. The first of these was the creation of what are known as blossom trees. It can turn what is an otherwise normal tree into a blossom tree in as little as 12 days. They are a large, upright structure with a bulb at the top. The bulb opens and then contracts on a regular basis. This releases microscopic quantities of Tiberium into the air. It also releases gas at the same time. These structures are almost like an anemone in some ways. There are other ways by which Tiberium can spread as well. One of these is the vinifera. Although we'll give more details on it shortly, understand that vinifera is a special class of Tiberium. If you get a large enough patch of vinifera, and it will grow to maturity, the crystals will come together and form one massive crystal. This crystal is 10 meters in height and functions similar to a blossom tree. The distinction it has is that it is much slower at producing the Tiberium crystals and gases which it releases into the air. The final mechanism by which Tiberium is spread is via underground veins. These spread out, almost like they're searching, and then once they get to a high enough concentration within a particular area, having fed on the local minerals, they break through to the surface. This creates a fissure, and the Tiberium crystals grow around this and begin the process of spreading again. Having understood how the Tiberium begins to spread, we should look at the types of Tiberium available. The first and most common is Riparius. This is the most common and earliest discovered form of Tiberium. The crystals from it are small and green. Riparius is also the least rich form of Tiberium. That is, it contains the lowest concentrations of minerals and metals. This means it's relatively less valuable, but due to its greater availability and ease of processing, it can be harvested for profit. It grows very quickly, and it is perhaps the fastest growing form of Tiberium. Vinifera is the second form, and as we mentioned, it also forms the larger crystals. It wasn't noticeable in the early games, and this could perhaps be due to the nature of its development. Vinifera develops once a patch of Riparius Tiberium has reached adequate quantities and concentrations. These then mature. The mature Riparius Tiberium turns into the Vinifera Tiberium. Unlike Riparius, which is green, Vinifera is blue, and that is not the only significant difference between it and Riparius, although it is similar in size and shape. The special properties of Vinifera that distinguish it greatly from Riparius are that it grows and increases in volume much more slowly than Riparius. It has a significantly higher mineral concentration. This increases its value greatly. One byproduct of this increase in value is that it is comparably significantly more combustible. It will detonate violently when brought into contact with any ignition source. Primarily it will respond to fire, explosives, or sonic waves. Like most Tiberium, this is also harmful to anything of an organic nature, but the Viniferous is more harmful than its Riparius counterpart. Finally, there is liquid Tiberium. This is relatively new within the in-game universe, and the exact provenance and nature of it is unknown. What is known is that it is both incredibly potent and unstable. In fact, given its volume, the energy yield is considerably higher than most conventional fuel sources. It's also the source of the explosion under Temple Prime. The liquid itself, once broken down into gases, produces an interesting chemical composition, it being about 22% methane, 19% sulfur, 12% naphthalene, 10% argon, 6% isobutane, 2% xylene, and nearly 30% of unknown composition. This is a significant increase over the Riparius Tiberium's 1.5% unknown composition. Tiberium can also form rather toxic clouds from this liquid and gas form. They're often seen being emitted from vein holes. Vein holes are a variation on Tiberium that develops later on in the series, or from Tiberium floaters. The floaters themselves are a creature of unknown origin, although likely to be a mutation of something naturally occurring on Earth due to Tiberium. Tiberium gas is highly corrosive, and this is a concern in a number of ways. Tiberium is very dense, and it creates what is called a dynamic proton lattice. This is held together by exotic heavy particles. And as much gibberish as that is, what is important is that when these heavy particles collide with the nuclei of other things, it causes them to be broken down. It incrementally removes protons or neutrons. This has a significant effect as, among other things, the protons that are ejected during this collision get incorporated in the Tiberium structure. This leads to the creation of more Tiberium. It also means that there's a good possibility that if any of these unknown elements are at the high end of the periodic table, that they might well be atomic in nature. And that would explain some of what we see elsewhere. That is, the long-term, low-level exposure to Tiberium causes a variety of illnesses, particularly the fact that it is mutagenic. If it is at the atomic end of the elemental table, it's likely that we are seeing radiation poisoning. Unlike radiation poisoning, treatment for Tiberium poisoning is more than less palliative, with it only being a means of delaying the end. Those who do die from Tiberium poisoning may see a slow death or a very quick death, but it is generally identifiable by the growth of Tiberium crystals on the skin. As the disease progresses, these become more pronounced, intruding and inhibiting more of the body's function. Death from Tiberium poisoning is complicated by further factors, particularly if someone is to die from Tiberium poisoning, they may develop an irregular mutation. This irregular mutation causes their body to break down into something known as a visceroid. A visceroid is an amoeba-looking organism, which has the ability to bleed fluids and gases. These then feed upon any nearby sources of Tiberium, and will attempt to digest anything that is of a genetic predisposition similar to what the original organism was. The Tiberium can do this to a number of different organisms, creating different Tiberium creatures. The visceroid being perhaps the most disconcerting given how it develops and the complete transformation to a human body to that of something more like a blob. Now that we know what Tiberium is, we can look at how feasible it is. We should perhaps begin by looking at Tiberium as a terraforming tool of sorts, rather than an organism. It can populate water, earth, and air, so much so that it reached a point at which it was measurable contaminant in the atmosphere. This is consistent with some of the in-universe theories. It has the capacity to harvest and concentrate precious metals and minerals. It would also make sense that liquid Tiberium, if it was used as a fuel source for, say, nanobots, why it would be so volatile. That incredible volatility makes sense when you compare it to some of our fuel sources early on. Sealed lead-acid batteries contain a very volatile substance. It's also very corrosive. If you had to find something that a self-replicating robot could rely on and generate for itself, liquid Tiberium makes sense to an extent. Self-replicating robots, or those used in terraforming, would also make sense, since they would need to deal with that both highly corrosive Tiberium base and a hostile environment. It is possible that it is a biological robot rather than a mechanical robot that we are familiar with. This is because many of our newer discoveries in science have looked at creating synthetic DNA. That is not to say that this would be a biological organism in the same terms that we know DNA to function. Rather, the DNA itself would be the instruction manual, and it would still be a relatively mechanical bot in its nature, whether that was still making things based on protein but to a code, rather than DNA. It is the diversity of Tiberium that we're seeing that makes it seem so unlikely to be a naturally occurring phenomena. It also makes it hard to narrow down the exact nature of Tiberium. We see 3 different kinds, going from the riparius to vinifera to the liquid Tiberium, but we also see it targeting multiple different organisms and manipulating them and mutating them into different organisms. This means that Tiberium has to be able to cope with a bunch of different inputs and still produce a diverse number of outputs. This does largely exclude many biological products. Many biological products that we're familiar with now are only good at targeting a single organism. When you combine that along with the chemical composition of the more volatile Tiberium variations, there's a lot of problems in getting down to a biological basis for it. Then the fact that it can act as both a radiation source and has no carbon backbone excludes just about any living life form that we are familiar with. If radiation was present in the concentrations we see it in-game, then it would damage and destroy any DNA-based backbone and instruction set. Any robot or similar might be able to cope with it with appropriate shielding, or a design that allows for this. If it was a very simple robot with limited function, but capacity for greater complexity with increase in size, this might make sense. It would also be similar to some of our current hive mind robots like these. As they grow in number, they are capable of more functionality, eventually reaching a critical mass where they achieve their maximum capacity. They then divide up and create more, almost like an ant colony. Tiberium seems to perform in a similar way. For this reason, it would make sense for Tiberium creatures to start with biologically similar organisms, as the Visceroids do. This is like recycling and repurposing. Of any sort, it is easy to start with something close to what the final product you want is, or something you are familiar with, break that down to recycle it or to repurpose it. Although it was hopeful that the screen would add somewhat to the lore around this, they don't necessarily do that. Their presence didn't necessarily expand on the nature of Tiberium beyond what was already known, except perhaps for the idea that the screen used Tiberium as a seeded product throughout the universe, that it is sent out to terraform these planets for some reason that we do not yet know. They do perhaps give greater credence to the idea of a nanobot-like system that utilizes biological products at first, and then develops more complex structures over time to compensate for the environment and resistance. This is supported by the fact that the screen themselves are a combination of biological and mechanical product. It seems likely that Tiberium acts very much like the Tyranids or Orcs of 40k. They exist to decompose, store, and then ship organic material to a central hub where it is then used. Although the exact reason why they exist and what they do is unknown, it would make sense for the Tiberium to be similar given its nature and functionality, and lack of specific targeted application. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.